Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today about demystifying TVA's integrated resource plan. My name is Chris Carnevale, and I'm the Climate Advocacy Director for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And I'm going to just get us kicked off here. And so first, before we start the presentation, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. We will be recording the presentation today, and so we'll be posting that on our website and on YouTube, so you'll have access to the recording afterward. And we have saved time at the end of the presentation for questions. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box in your Zoom screen, and we'll work to get through as many of those as we can in the time we have following the presentation. If you are a reporter, please, and you ask a question, please identify the publication that you're with in your question so we can know who you are and which publication you're representing. Next slide, please. So this presentation is being put on by the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, SACE, or otherwise known as SACE. SACE is a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible and equitable energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. As a leading voice for energy policy in our region, SACE is focused on transforming the way we produce and consume energy in the Southeast. With that, I will turn it over to SACE's Executive Director, Dr. Stephen Smith.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody, for joining. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So we're going to today talk about integrated resource planning by the Tennessee Valley Authority. TVA was first required to do the first public IRP back in 1995, coming out of the 1992 Energy Policy Act, where they were required to start doing publicly. There was a long gap from 95 until basically 2011, after the Kingston coal ash spill. A number of us encouraged TVA to start doing integrated resource planning on a regular cadence because they had skipped so long. And they had agreed to do an IRP approximately every 5 years. And so basically 2011, 2015, 2019, and then now we're a little bit beyond the 5-year cadence. They've got a draft out that we'll be talking about. Integrated resource planning is a complicated business. It has a lot of moving parts to it. And fortunately, we have Maggie Schober on our staff that's going to walk folks through that complicated stuff. But it's easy to get lost in all of this. It's easy to lose perspective. I posted some on social media the other night. I was joking about TVA's spending millions of dollars on an integrated resource plan, and yet they don't have a plan. And you'll see us talking within our concerns is that TVA has put out a draft that has an extraordinarily wide range of possible directions. TVA constantly reminds us that this is a compass, like a compass, not a GPS. And so therefore they want to have lots of flexibility. And to some degree, that's true. But if you don't have a through line, you don't have a clear direction of where you want to go, then the IRP becomes virtually meaningless because you're just throwing out these wide-ranging possibilities without any real clear intent or direction. Now, we believe that TVA needs to have a very clear direction where they're going, which is to basically be moving away from burning fossil fuels to produce the electricity that we all consume. And that is not an abstract concept. What we have on the screen here is the Keeling curve. The Keeling curve is an annual measure that's been taken since 1958 that basically documents how atmospheric carbon dioxide, CO2, has been rising in the atmosphere. If you remember, going back in time, science has shown very clearly that for about the last 800,000 years, we've consistently been below 300 parts per million, before the Industrial Revolution took place in the 1700s, 1800s, we were, 280 parts per million. And this has been documented with all types of scientific verification going back that time, using ice cores and other sampling techniques from the natural environment. And you can see that as of December 2nd, we're at 424 parts per million. Some of you who follow our blog may have seen a blog that I wrote a month or so ago after the Helene hurricane ripped through the Southeast and did extraordinary damage, particularly in Western North Carolina, but actually throughout the whole Southeast. And the name of that blog is We're Not in Kansas Anymore, because we're fundamentally out of any place that humans have ever been in recorded history. We are way out of line with what's going on. And the fact that the CO2 is so high, remember, CO2 is like a blanket, and as the infrared radiation comes in from the sun, it does not allow it to radiate back to space. And so we are warming the climate at an extraordinary rate. You can go to the Keeling curve, and I encourage each of you to do this and identify the year you were born. And you can see what the carbon dioxide levels were the year you were born. For me, it was 318. So in my lifetime, in the 62 years, it's gone up 107 parts per million in my lifetime. What is really scary is we have awareness about this, but in the last 2 years, it's gone up faster than it's ever gone up since it's ever been recorded. We're seeing it actually accelerating, not slowing down. Now, this is in spite of all the things that we're doing. We're seeing a surge in renewable energy. We're seeing international conferences on climate change. We're having lots of discussion. But the bottom line is this curve is going in the wrong direction, and it is accelerating in the wrong direction. So when I say that TVA doesn't have a plan for their IRP, the overarching plan should be to reduce their carbon emissions to zero, just like it should be for all the other utilities. And they should be choosing that as their preferred route instead of just saying, oh, we're going to go whichever way the wind blows. We have all these different options. They need to have a definitive plan to get to net or absolute zero in their carbon emissions. And so we're going to talk about where they're falling short on some of those goals. And we strongly encourage you to register your comments and say, this curve is going to determine the quality of life that we all have and our children have going forward. If we're unraveling the natural environment, a lot of things just don't matter anymore. Economics, all this other stuff becomes secondary if we're destroying the ecological foundations of our planet. And this is what this curve represents. So when you look at this and when you listen to what we're doing, when you think about your comments, we strongly encourage you to weigh in and help the TVA board and the decision makers at TVA realize, as one of the largest utilities in the world, definitely in our country, they can actually make a big difference by getting us to zero. So with that, let me turn it over to Maggie Schober and let her introduce you and take you through, and then we'll engage in Q&A here in a little bit. Maggie?
Great. Thanks, Steve. All right, what a way to kick it off. Put a little context on what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to go through a number of slides. There's going to be charts, there's going to be figures, there's going to be words. I'm going to go through things as clearly as I can, but as has already been mentioned, there will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And so please use the Q&A box to ask your questions as we go. As Steve mentioned, IRPs, or integrated resource planning, which is the term that's used in the electricity sector for future planning. IRPs can feel quite complicated, and even more so lately. And I would argue that electric utilities in particular are facing some real challenges around decarbonization and other factors across the sector. And as a result of that, there seems to be a desire to, further present IRPs as these very complicated matters that only, experts can weigh in on. I disagree with that. I have, run the models myself that are run during IRPs. I've been involved in these sorts of processes, and there are a lot of details, but overall, the process and the idea of what we're trying to do here is not complicated. This is a process to determine where we go with how electricity is produced and consumed across our region in a specific utility territory. So an IRP is a forward look at what sorts of power plants, what sorts of resources, any sort of power lines, often called transmission lines, and other programs such as energy efficiency or EV charging that the utility will pursue in the future to keep electricity flowing, to keep the lights on. So why is this process unique to the electricity sector? There's a couple of reasons. One is that electricity is a monopoly industry. So especially here in the Southeast, you move to a new apartment or a house, you open up a business, you don't get to pick who your electricity provider is. There's one utility and you're served by that utility. So because there's no market competition, there's a process called integrated resource planning, whereby utilities look out into the future and determine what is the best way in terms of cost and other factors to meet electricity needs. And that's seen as a check on monopoly utility power. The other reason that this process is unique to the electricity sector, is that at least historically, it would take a really long time to build stuff, especially when most power plants were coal or nuclear. It's not like you could go out and build those in a year or two. And even gas plants being proposed today, they take more than 2 or 3 years to come online, typically. And the other piece is that there are a lot of additional factors besides just, economic, that come into these planning processes. Our electricity generation is having a really big impact on the environment through climate change, as Steve went through, both carbon dioxide and methane emissions, as well as clean air and clean water. We're seeing prices and costs increase across the board, and that includes folks' electricity bills. We are seeing real impacts on economies, either local or regional economies, when power plants, solar farms, and other infrastructure is brought to a region, when it's retired, and also having businesses shopping around for certain costs for their electricity, but also certain clean energy goals that they have. So the way I've put it here, an IRP, it actually impacts everybody. Everybody that pays an electric bill, breathes air, drinks water, is concerned about the environment and is concerned about the economy. All right. So what does an IRP do? How does it work? So an IRP is a process to answer some pretty key questions. The load forecast is a sort of technical way to say how much need will there be for electricity in the future, and what will that look like? Where will it show up? And then that's, on one side of the equation. On the other side is, okay, how are we going to meet that electricity? What power plants do we already have online? What might we need? What kinds of technologies are available? What do they cost? What kind of fuels do they use? and how is that going to shape the future of our system. There's other ways to meet load, which is through things like energy efficiency, other sort of customer behaviors that can either lower the need for generation or can shift, from peak demand to off-peak times. And those can help lower the cost that the utility has to serve everyone, and that then lowers everyone's electricity bills. And then let's look at our grid, our transmission and distribution. Transmission means the really big power lines, distribution of the smaller power lines that go, to your homes and apartment buildings. And so there we ask the question, even if we have enough electricity, can we get it to where it needs to be? And do we have a reliable system, such as during extreme weather events? So TVA has a few unique things around how it does an IRP. They have an IRP website, which we'll provide later in the presentation, and in a follow-up email. You can just Google TVA IRP, it'll come up. So I'll go through this relatively quickly, but if you want to go back and study this or ask a question about it, we can address it. So TVA puts together what they call the IRP working group, which is an invite-only, confidential, hand-selected working group by TVA staff. And those are the folks that have interactions with TVA staff as the staff are developing the IRP. And what sort of interactions are they having? Mostly it's about what does the future look like? What different futures are we going to study? TVA breaks this out into two different areas, what they call scenarios and strategies. So scenarios are things that are out of TVA's control, and strategies are things within TVA's control. And so TVA picked, for this IRP, picked 6 scenarios, that's 6 potential futures, and 5 strategies. And then they ran their IRP model for each combination of those. And so they end up with 30 separate portfolios. So a portfolio just means that it's a potential plan. So every year, this is how many megawatts and megawatt hours from each resource we're going to need. Okay, so the first year we're going to build, 200 megawatts of solar, and next year we're going to build 300 megawatts of solar. It looks like that for each resource. So some of the scenarios and strategies that TVA looked at on the scenarios, they're basically looking with and without a greenhouse gas regulation, and at various load growth. So is there slow load growth, medium, or high? For strategies, they looked at sort of a baseline, how we did things 20 years ago, to B is what they call innovation focus. That's got a lot of emphasis on things like new nuclear and hydrogen. Strategy C is their carbon-free, is their carbon-free commercial ready. So those are resources that are available today. And there's a lot of solar and wind and batteries in those. D is distribution focused. So that's got your energy efficiency, demand response, and distributed resources. And then E is what they call resiliency focused. And you can read more about those in the IRP itself. And thanks for, and we've put the IRP website in the chat so you guys can peruse that. All right, so after TVA puts out its draft IRP, they accept comments. This is the part in the process we're in right now. This is why we're having this conversation today, so that hopefully you guys can submit some comments on the IRP. And what they're asking for is comments on the draft IRP, things you would like to see. This is through the NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act. And after TVA compiles those comments, they put them together in a final IRP, and that is what the board votes on. And that is what theoretically should provide guardrails on what TVA can do, what resources it can build in the future without having to do another IRP. So if your IRP says you can do, between 200 and 400 megawatts of solar next year, you can't go out and do 600, but you should try not to do, 100, right? This chart here, and my apologies if it's kind of small, on this page is from TVA's 2019 final IRP. And what they did was they took every single scenario and strategy and sensitivity that they ran, and they lumped them together to have these huge ranges of different resources. And as Steve mentioned, that makes the IRP essentially meaningless. Because if I say, okay, next year I'm going to build somewhere between 0 and 14,000 megawatts of solar, well, I can literally do any number within there. And the same thing for some of these other resources. So one thing that we at SACE have been advocating for TVA to do is to have a more narrow range of resources, at least in the near term. We don't know we don't want to hamper what TVA can do in 2040 today. That doesn't make sense. But TVA should be limited in what it can do in the next 5 to 8 years. And if TVA wants to do something different, it should have to go through another TVA, another IRP to show holistically why that change in direction is warranted. So we're not saying we can't change direction. We just need to go through a holistic process in order to do that, and it shouldn't happen behind closed doors. So a little bit about, this is the final sort of process piece. TVA is not what we think of as a typical regulated utility. That would be like a Duke Energy or a Southern Company. Those utilities are regulated at the state level by a Public Utilities Commission or a Public Service Commission. And they have to do IRPs typically every 2, maybe 3 years. And there's a very sort of regimented process around how both the public, stakeholders, and experts can weigh into that process. And then there is an independent entity that really makes the final decision on, what the utility should use as its guide as it goes into the future. And those are the PSC or PUCs. At TVA, while they do have a TVA board that ultimately has to approve the IRP, you can see here, and we have a whole blog on how TVA's IRP process is different. But you can see here with this graphic that there's a real difference between the two processes, as well as how the independent regulators act in the process. TVA's is much more driven by TVA staff and TVA leadership, not so much by the independent regulator or an independent regulator, and also is actually less transparent and less of a back and forth about the issues publicly. Now, I will say TVA has done more on transparency in this IRP than they did in the 2019 IRP. If you go to the IRP webpage that's in the chat, you can actually scroll down to the bottom. They have a lot of files linked that show, some data and reports behind the IRP. So that's a baby step forward, but it's still not the process that we see for other regulated utilities in the region. All right, so now I'm going to kind of shift to getting into what's in the IRP itself, the draft IRP. This is a graphic from TVA, just copy and pasted straight from the executive summary of the IRP, and it shows some of the things in those 30 portfolios that we talked about. And so they're showing in 2035 that there could be a wide range of capacity additions from gas and solar, as well as some impacts from things like energy efficiency, storage, and wind. So I thought their graphic was interesting. I wanted to create my own, which kind of simplifies it a little bit. to show that, to show some of the differences in these IRPs and where things are actually pretty similar. So these pie charts show just clean and fossil-based energy in 3 different years: today, 2024, 2030, and 2035. And so from 2024 to 2030, a number of the portfolios only show a very slight change in the resource mix as far as percentage clean and percentage fossil from today. In fact, a fifth of all of the portfolios show a decrease in the percentage of clean energy in 2030 compared to today. So a fifth of portfolios show the percentage of clean energy, the percentage of energy that TVA gets from clean sources decreasing between now and 2030. The highest levels are in the 60 to 62% range, and only a fifth of portfolios actually achieve that 60%. Most of them stay pretty flat compared to the 53% that we see today. We do see wider ranges in 2035, mostly driven by whether or not the scenario has an economy-wide carbon regulation. And that was simulated in the modeling primarily by putting a price on the emission of carbon in the modeling itself. Some of those scenarios saw over 90% from clean energy sources by 2035, which is a really positive sign. But without that sort of economy-wide carbon regulation, carbon price, any sort of that kind of a regulation, we didn't see any portfolios that got over the 75% clean energy level. So based on just what TVA itself is saying it could do, it's really capping out at that 75% clean by 2035. Whereas, if there's an outside action taken for a greenhouse gas regulation, that's what's really going to take it from that 75 to 90+%. And then it was not a surprise for us, but strategies with more energy efficiency and renewable energy did achieve the highest percentage of clean energy. So let's talk a little bit about some of these resources. Renewables in the IRP. So I've highlighted 3 renewable resources here, 3 wind resources here and 2 solar resources here. On the wind side, HVDC stands for high voltage DC direct current wind, and then Midwest wind. Those 2 are wind resources outside of the TVA service territory that TVA would use transmission to connect into the TVA grid. Southeast high hub wind means it's located here in the southeast. The solar is a little more obvious. Distributed means it's distributed throughout the system. It's, on folks' rooftops, it's, on businesses, it's community solar, whereas utility scale solar or utility solar is the really larger solar projects. So utility, as you can see from the chart here, and this is the range. So I've taken, from the 30 portfolios, what are the lowest levels of each of these resources and what are the highest levels of each of these resources. And strategy C, again, is the one that focuses on renewables. So you can see that across both all strategies and within strategy C, the main renewable resource is utility scale solar, but that there are a number of portfolios that do have both wind and distributed solar. And I thought I would put some of these numbers into perspective. We just found out last month in their 10K filing to the SEC that TVA has just over 1,000 megawatts of solar on its system. Whereas in the IRP, TVA says it could add up to, or even in some cases more than 1,850 megawatts of solar per year. So for me, there's a real disconnect there between those two. There's how much solar TVA has been able to add to date, how much they have on their system, and how quickly they have been going on solar compared to how quickly they think they can go. So even if we're seeing in these IRP portfolios where they have really large solar numbers, we also need to hear from TVA how they're going to actually achieve those kinds of high levels of solar, and we want to see real action taken on those things. Another key clean energy resource is on the demand side, which is energy efficiency. So energy efficiency can mean a lot of different things. I like to explain it using examples because I feel like that just makes it a little more tangible for folks. So if a utility can save electricity by helping someone purchase a more efficient refrigerator, a more efficient HVAC system, put insulation in their house, that means they will need to generate less electricity. That lowers the cost of the whole system, and that then lowers everybody's bills. There's obviously a cost to the energy efficiency program, whatever incentives you're going to give to folks to go from kind of that baseline to something that's more efficient. But that can pale in comparison to the cost of building whole new power plants, pipelines, transmission and distribution lines, all those sorts of things. And TVA has a really interesting history on energy efficiency. I'm going to try and get into a little bit of that here, but you can look on our blogs and past energy efficiency reports for more on that if you're interested in digging deeper. In TVA's 2015 IRP in particular, there was really a pretty, what I would call, decent, substantial emphasis on energy efficiency, and TVA had a plan starting in 2015 to increase annual savings up over 16,000 gigawatt hours a year. That's pretty significant. However, that never actually materialized. And then when TVA came back in 2019 and did that IRP, you can sort of see, it might be hard to see, that yellow line is very close to zero. So the 2019 IRP, the pendulum fully swung away from energy efficiency, and there was little to no energy efficiency in the IRP. TVA basically pulled back all of its energy efficiency programs except for a few focused on low income weatherization. So we're seeing more energy efficiency in this IRP than we did in the last one. That's not it's not a huge compliment because basically when you're at or close to zero, anything is more than that. But there's some good signs here. As you can see, I've graphed out the range again from sort of the lowest scenario to the highest scenario strategy combo. Here, they're still not quite getting up to what they were projecting in the 2015 IRP, but they're getting close, and it's certainly a shift in how that resource is treated. All right, and again, just providing some context, this energy efficiency, this chart here is a ranking of major Southeast utilities on how much savings they got in 2023 compared to their retail sales. So as a percentage of retail sales, how much did they actually get in energy efficiency savings? And historically, and again in 2023, the Southeast as a whole trails nationally in terms of how much energy efficiency we have, and also As you can see by that, red circle, TVA is trailing, pretty much trailing the region as a whole. Only Florida Power and Light and Alabama Power are doing worse than TVA. Now, in the figures from 2022 or 2021, previous years, TVA was at the 0.02%, and so they've moved up to 0.07%. Again, that's the right direction, but we need that to move quite significantly, farther and faster. And there really is a lot more room in the IRP for TVA to do more on energy efficiency than it has indicated in this draft IRP. If we're limited to the scenarios in the IRP itself, it should be really going after those top end numbers. All right, fossil gas. Some folks call this methane gas. Historically, it was called natural gas. So this is a resource that appears a lot in the IRP in a few different ways. First is that there was about 3,500 megawatts of total capacity for gas power plants that was forced into the model by TVA staff. This means the model didn't choose it because it was economic or reliable or any of those things. These are projects that the person running the model said this has to go in. And so it's in every single portfolio because it had to be. So we don't know what would happen in scenarios where those projects do not exist. Those projects are at the Cumberland coal plant location, which is near Clarksville, Tennessee, sort of ish. Kingston, Tennessee, which is just a little bit west of Knoxville. Cheatham County, also in Tennessee. Allen, which is in Memphis, and then New Caledonia, which is in northern Mississippi. So some of those projects are in various stages of either consideration or sort of the early stages of construction. Cumberland requires a new gas pipeline. That pipeline, work on that pipeline is currently stopped by a court. And the Kingston, the pipeline that's serving the Kingston gas power plant is also hasn't been approved yet. And for the other three projects, Allen, Cheatham County, and New Caledonia, TVA has not completed environmental reviews of those or made any sort of final decisions. They've in fact only released a draft environmental review for New Caledonia. So there were some bright spots, in my opinion, on the gas side, which is that there were, except for the projects forced in, there were a number of portfolios that had no new gas, except for, again, the ones forced in. So it was pretty clear that those were the scenarios that had a lot more energy efficiency, demand response, and distributed generation, which offset the need for new gas peakers. And a carbon regulation appears to force the model to choose resources other than what I'm calling here gas baseload power plants. Those are called combined cycles. Another interesting point is that in scenarios with a carbon regulation, TVA assumes that all of its new gas plants can switch over to use hydrogen, and in some cases that it can build new gas plants with carbon capture, also known as CCS. So a big one when looking at an IRP is cost. A lot of times this is, this is the main purpose is to look at what's called least cost planning and plan a system based on cost. It's how it's the main metric that the models use to choose resources to lower the overall utility cost. That utility cost is what gets divvied up and becomes everyone's utility bills. So electricity bills are made up of the cost for generation, that's the power plants, transmission and distribution, those are the power lines, and the fuel for those power plants that are fuel-based. And those fuel costs are unique among the rest of the costs because they are passed on directly to customers in TVA system as they're happening per month. So an example of this is that when gas prices spiked because of the start of the Ukraine war and through the whole first year of that Ukraine war, gas prices were really high, and TVA saw a real TVA customers, families, businesses, businesses of all sizes saw higher bills because of that. So I pulled out two of the cost charts from TVA's IRP here to share with you. There's more in the IRP itself, but these are two things I think are really key. System average cost. So this is, what's the dollars per megawatt hour that this system as a whole is going to cost on average. And then the other one is cost stability, because we want two things. We want the cost to be low, and we also want them to be stable. We don't want them going up and down every month, because that has its own challenges. And I've highlighted strategies C and D because it's clear across multiple, potential futures, high load, low load, regulation, no regulation, that there are some commonalities between strategies C and D and why we think they are directionally the best for folks interested in having low and stable electricity bills, which includes me. I want a low and stable electricity bill. So you can see in the top chart that C and D tend to have lower system average costs, especially lower than B and E. And you can see in the bottom chart that they also tend to have lower cost stability, especially compared to A, B, and E in some of these different scenarios. All right. So a few additional points on the IRP that I thought folks might be interested in, which is that TVA has 4 remaining coal plants on its system, and in all scenarios, they were retiring those by 2035. In TVA's 2019 IRP, they stated they would start a distributed resource planning process, kind of like an IRP, but at the distribution level for distributed resources. That hasn't happened yet. That's fairly complicated here with TVA because the distribution systems are managed by all of TVA's utility customers who are ultimately serving the customers, or most of the customers in the valley. Also is that we see, it's always been important, but an increasing importance of integrating transmission planning with your generation planning. This IRP is really focused on the generation side, as well as some of the energy efficiency, pieces, but did not look closely at transmission planning. And TVA has stated that they will, in this draft IRP, they state that they will initiate a separate integrated transmission plan, or ITP process. And then they have a long-term goal of combining the ITP and the IRP. And I think that's, really good. We need to have them integrated. I'd like to see those integrated a little bit sooner. All right, so that's as fast as I could say it. My overview of the IRP. I'm going to quickly go over how to comment, but again, please be adding your Q&A to the through the Q&A bar, so we can have a little bit of a discussion here. So the deadline to comment is December 11th. There's 2 different ways to do that. The first one is go to this website. This will be in the follow-up email that we will send to everybody that registered. So you can just click on it. And I think it was also, it's in the chat as well. You can scroll to where that big red arrow shows you to submit a comment, and it pulls up this form here. You type in, some basic information, and then you can either, directly type in your comments in a box, or you can upload a file. Another way to comment is to send an email to irp@tva.gov with draft 2025 IRP comments in the subject line. We're missing an E there. And again, these will be included in a follow-up. What do you want to say in comments? This is pretty wide open. You can say literally whatever you want. But here are some thoughts that I had that folks might be interested in sort of, guiding what you might want to, what kind of questions you might want to answer, and some thoughts on how I would answer those. So what resources do you want to see in the future? From an electricity standpoint, what do you like? What do you not like? Do you like solar? You don't like gas? You like energy efficiency. You don't want any new pipelines, those sorts of things. And also, what is important to you? What are your priorities when looking at this? Do you want to make sure electricity bills are low and retire all the coal plants? Do you want to look at, being able to have reliability on your home, have solar and storage on your home, and still be able to sell that any excess solar to your neighbors? And what else should TVA study? One thing I'm interested in is what if we combine strategy C and D? This idea we need to pick renewables or energy efficiency, I think is silly. We can do both. We should do both. And then again, the look at transmission, especially regional transmission. How can we work more with our neighbors? And again, just trying to emphasize, IRPs can appear very technical and daunting. Your comments to the IRP can be as technical as you want them to be. If you want to go into detail about one aspect of the IRP that you're really excited about or really concerned about, please do so. If you just want to be, hit a few high-level points, please do so. This is the best chance over the next 5 years, because that's when we think TVA is going to do another IRP. This is the best chance to let TVA know what's important to you. TVA staff goes through all of the comments, and they summarize them and provide responses in an appendix in the final IRP. So your comments will be read and will be responded to. And as part of that process, TVA does have to cite whether and how it changed anything in its final IRP based on those comments. And kind of obvious from the whole presentation, but decisions from this IRP in particular will have lasting impacts on the economy, on the environment, will impact all of our electricity bills over years to come. All right, so with that, I will start the Q&A process. Chris, are you leading us through this?
I am. I will help moderate. So thank you, Maggie, for a great presentation. For everyone on the line, please go ahead, and if you have a question, submit it via the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll work to get through as many as we can. We have about 10 minutes. We're going to end at the end of the hour, and we probably already have enough questions to fill that time, but please go ahead and get them in. And just a reminder, if there's any reporters, please identify in your question what outlet you represent. All right, so the first question, this is for both of you, Steve and Maggie. Could public comments and various stakeholders, including clean energy activists, have any sway in demanding TVA come up with an interim 5 to 8 year energy plan?
Well, I think TVA actually does an annual review every year where they update their plan. And so I do believe that you can have some impact. What the IRP does, because they also have a concurrent National Environmental Policy Act coverage of the IRP, it allows them, as long as they stay within the broad parameters of the IRP, not to have to do detailed NEPA documents every single time. So absolutely, people should comment, and I think the more voices, the stronger the voices that are calling for a shorter range plan that has very clear, definitive goals, the better. But TVA is a very large institution that is very slow to move and sometimes can seem impenetrable. So don't let that frustrate you. But I think keeping the pressure on is always a good thing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. We're already hearing that I think some public pressure on this in particular has means that some of TVA's board members as well are interested in having a more narrow energy plan in the interim, that sort of next 5 to 8 years. And so I think that absolutely public pressure has an impact on an entity. I understand where this comment is coming from. I feel this way sometimes too. This is such a big entity. How do we have an influence? And I think that we have seen, have seen public demands having an influence in the last year or so in making this IRP slightly more, transparent than past IRPs.
And let me throw one other real quick point in. TVA is the wholesale provider of power, but everyone who is receiving electricity at their home, it is going through what is in essence a local power company, can be a municipal or co-op. And effectively you own the co-op if you're a member of it. And as a citizen in the city, the municipal power is supposed to be there to work for you. So your only avenue is not just with, this sort of monolithic, great big TVA board. They need to hear from you, but you actually have the ability to have a local voice with your local power company too, and demand that they are taking some of these commitments to reducing carbon emissions and having more clean energy sources and more energy efficiency available. Those things can sometimes be more impactful on the local level. And then, asking that they then put pressure on TVA also to do the right thing as their customer.
The next question is, how is TVA incentivized or motivated as an organization? They don't have shareholders, nor do they take taxpayer dollars. So what drives them to make the financial decisions they do?
Well, that's very insightful. They are a nonprofit. So theoretically, they're not supposed to be motivated by money. Unfortunately, when the board was restructured, all the CEOs that have led TVA have come from private power entities, primarily Progress Energy and Duke, all three of them, since the board has been restructured. And there does seem to be infected with a mindset that is very consistent with a for-profit entity, just without any accountability. So the motivations are hard to read sometimes. And what we detect more than anything else is they're large industrial customers, and the most vocal of their local power companies seem to be the ones that they're primarily listening to and they're primarily motivated by. But again, as Maggie pointed out in the comparison between TVA and other investor-owned utilities, there is no independent oversight of TVA. TVA's board is, quote unquote, the regulator. Congress has sort of abdicated their responsibility to provide oversight, and there is no independent regulator at the state level. So TVA's motivations are kind of up to whoever's in the C-suite and whatever level the board wants to actually encourage the executives to do the right thing.
Okay, thanks for that input, Steve. All right, next question. What ability would the new presidential administration have to change this version of the IRP once it's finalized?
You want me to take that one, Steve? I can.
Yeah,
Sure.
go ahead.
So this IRP, once it's final and approved by the board, is final and is the IRP under which TVA is operating until there's a new IRP, and that is finalized by whatever the board looks like at that point. So there's no direct control that a presidential administration has over TVA. It all runs through the board of directors, which is nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. So there will be an indirect influence potentially on future IRPs, but they can't claw back this specific IRP.
Okay. Now I have a few questions on the gas additions in the IRP. Are they intended to replace the retiring coal units and coal plants? That's the first question. Second question, do you know where they get their gas from? Like Appalachia or the Permian Basin? And then finally, should TVA rerun their models without forcing the 3,500 megawatts of gas plants?
I think they should. And if you agree, that's something you can put in your comments, because something they need to hear is, what additional sensitivities, what additional studies do they need to run before they finalize anything? And I think that would be a really important one to look at. To the question on whether the gas is replacing coal, some of it is, and some of it isn't. That 3,500 megawatts includes the Cumberland, Kingston, and Cheatham County that are all, at least in part, replacing the retiring coal plants at Cumberland and Kingston. But the Allen and the New Caledonia gas plants, at least the reasoning for them that TVA has cited in the NEPA process comment, NEPA documents, those are not directly tied to coal retirements. And there's a third part of the question. Oh, where do they get their gas from? They get their gas from two major pipelines. And so it's a combination from a variety of different sources. You can't really, once the gas is in the pipelines, you can't parse out and say this is from, this basin or that basin, but primarily from, either Texas, Louisiana, from west into here, as well as from, Pennsylvania and those regions. So it can come from either direction.
And Chris, let me add two real quick things here in response to the gas. One, gas does not have to be the choice. Solar plus storage is actually the preferred option, should be the preferred option in the way that TVA is meeting their future load growth. And we believe very strongly that TVA should bring their renewable portfolio, renewables and storage, up to where it's comparable to their nuclear portfolio, which is roughly 40% of their generation. And then we can debate the remaining 20% as we get the renewables caught up. They don't have to be building gas. Matter of fact, they did an ineffective job of modeling solar and storage in this IRP. And we believe that by looking at that, they would have done it a better job. The other thing is that a lot of the new load growth that's being projected, not only in the TVA region, but across the whole country, is this AI bubble that's being perpetuated, this digital demand where all these folks are rushing to be the first to have large language model, server farms at massive scales. And that demand is not required for basic support of human needs. It's, almost a get rich quick scheme for a lot of these people in that space. And it is being done in a way that does not bring the traditional values that we see when you have large load coming onto the system with lots of employment and lots of economic benefits that spread throughout the economy. So some of this load forecast is chasing after demand that is not necessary in the classic way. And we want to make sure that we're not getting locked into generation sources that are damaging the environment and may ultimately be stranded at some point in the future. And that's why TVA needs to take a go slow approach about this and make sure they're making the right decisions so that they're making the right decarbonized decisions instead of, chasing mythological load that may or may not appear and then lock in customers to an archaic way of generating power that's actually damaging the environment.
Okay. So we're at the end of our hour. We have a number of questions we haven't been able to get to. Steve and Maggie, can you do one more question about solar before we wrap?
No, let's keep going. If we've got good questions, we can go for a few more minutes.
Okay, great. All right. All right. So actually we have a handful of questions about solar. I'll lump them together. Why has TVA been so slow to deploy utility scale solar when it has lower and more stable costs? So that's one on utility scale solar. Another related question. TVA's IRP estimated very large land requirements for solar in some scenarios, but TVA's assumption for land use seems to be several times as much per megawatt as other estimates, for example, from National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And then finally, if you might talk about why their plan for distributed solar is so low. So any of those would be good.
I can start with some of those. On the land requirements, I agree there's a real disconnect there. I think that is something that is absolutely ripe for folks to put in comments. I hope that people can pull that from, if you open up the Q&A, you can see the question there, if you didn't catch what Chris read. And so, yes, there's a disconnect between what other entities are assuming are the land requirements for solar and what TVA is assuming here. On the distributed solar, TVA is doing their distributed solar forecast based on